I'm a crime novelist. The book is a crime novel. There is a crime in it and there's a plot as the genre requires. But when I originally came up with Jack and with the whole idea for the book, I wasn't particularly interested in doing it from the perspective of a police officer or a detective. I was more interested in the character himself as opposed to the crime that might have been perpetrated. Because Jack, I hope, is an everyday man. He's a guy who lives in Sydney, is frustrated by the things that we're all frustrated by in cities and in Sydney in particular, i.e. terrible public transport, colourful Sydney figures who are corrupt in government and council offices, etc., etc. And what I wanted to discover was how an everyday man, somebody who lived in the city, worked in the city, struggled in the city, dealt with his moral compass if suddenly he found himself in some, sticky situations basically, dramas. Now, Jack's not a character that's averse to these things. He's got a bit of a shady past. In the first novel, that's hinted at, and certainly hinted at again in the second novel. So I wanted to get a sense of this character as being someone who was, like many of us maybe are, attracted to ideas of lust and the femme fatale, attracted to ideas of money, of escaping their particular station in life with a sudden financial boom. So Jack certainly shares with a lot of us the desire to, in a nice way, to better our situation. He's a wonderful character for me because in discovering him and writing about him, I was able to move from being an unpublished writer to a published writer. And the reason I say that is because I was lucky enough to go through, or have, an epiphany. As was mentioned earlier, the first works that I had published were actually poetry. Often I get asked the question, how do you move from poetry to crime fiction? With great difficulty in some cases, but I was very, very lucky. And I'll just reiterate here that if anyone has a question later about are you Jack, I'm going to say equivocally no. But I do share some experiences. One of those, of course, is that I've worked in a bookshop myself. Now, I was extremely lucky. I worked in an independent bookshop in Sydney, and I met the Australian poet Robert Gray there. And basically, I spent my whole time there sucking up to him on Saturday nights when we shared the shift together, because I was very keen to glean from him any information he might be able to give me about how to get published. Do you know anybody? And I was basically working up to the point of having the confidence to say, could you please read some of my work? Along the way, he taught me how to read poetry, which is something I'd never had any confidence in. And one particular night, which is my first little half epiphany, we were working late. I think the shop closed at 9 o'clock in those days. We liked to have a bottle of wine in the back, probably a nice Barossa Red, if I remember correctly. And he handed me a book, and it was The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. And he said to me, have you ever read it? Now here I was being, what's the best way to put it? I suppose a young, slightly arrogant, wannabe writer. I always envisaged myself as being the Australian Samuel Beckett. I was very serious. I was very keen to be the philosophising writer, the man you went to who told you stories but also told you a little bit about yourself. Of course, when I realised I didn't know much and that was not ever going to work, I changed my tune. But Chandler had a lot to do with it. Now, Robert's words to me when he handed me this book were, have you read it? And I said, no. And he said, a pleasure yet to be had. And even though, and I haven't admitted it to him to this day, we've become good friends, it took me about a year to actually get down to read it. When I did, I've described it before as, it's like I ripped a handbrake on in the car and did a sudden U-turn and went down a one-way street and didn't care about red lights or speed cameras. It absolutely blew me away. And I always love to quote the first line because it was the first line that got me immediately. And if you'll excuse my attempt at an American accent, the line was, it was about 11 o'clock in the morning, mid-October, with the sun not shining and a look of hard wet rain in the clearness of the foothills. And I was so stunned by this. And for me, not only was it a moment of appreciation and sudden joy and pleasure, as Robert had predicted, but I felt like I'd come home somewhere because in those first lines I sensed poetry. And there was also this world-weary cynicism. And there was a character that I suddenly was immediately interested in. Who was the man, in this case Philip Marlowe, I suppose inadvertently Raymond Chandler himself, that was looking at the world in this way. That first chapter I've gone on the record as to say is the greatest first chapter ever written in the history of literature. And I always apologise to William Shakespeare for that, but that's my opinion in this case. the chapter goes on to describe a door as being big enough to let through 100 Indian elephants. And there's another example of this poetry, basically. And that was the thing that I saw. So in the end, through Chandler, I was led to a lot of other writers of that whole American tradition, which is sort of from the 1930s to about the 1950s. Everyone will know Dashiell Hammett, but there's a few obscure guys like David Goodis and Cornell Woolrich. These guys just completely blew me away. And suddenly, I've always said to writing students that come to some writing classes that I take, the difference between a reader and a writer is the writer suddenly looks at a book that he's read and goes, oh geez, I wish I'd written that. And the fire is sort of lit and we need to move on from there. And I certainly thought that with these guys. But the other great thing about this discovery, which I thank Robert for initiating, was that I rediscovered the pleasure of reading. Now that sounds funny from a writer, but often when you spend your time trying to get published and you're practicing your craft and you're working hard at it, you sort of forget what it is to be a reader because you're so obsessed with becoming a writer. And at those moments when you're struggling, and it's only you that's really, I'm very lucky, I've got a wife that's always been very supportive. I've also got a son who, when asked, what does daddy do? And this is from a 3-year-old, he says, typing. So he always keeps my ego in check. But the rediscovery of that pleasure was the big thing as well. Because you get caught up in the fantasy, you know, while you're struggling and while no one knows who you are and you're locked away in your room doing your work, every now and then you just need to sort of fire up that smell of an oily rag, and so you imagine yourself as a writer and what that might mean, and what that might feel like. And anything like that ends up usually being a distraction from what it is that you need to do. And what you need to do is tell stories. So what also went out the window for me was any kind of sort of, you know, intellectual egoism in terms of that I was going to achieve some kind of sense of myself that other people would suddenly appreciate. I mean, that's always the first lesson in life. Whatever you think about yourself is exactly not what everyone else thinks about you anyway. So the sooner you can share that as a writer, the sooner I think you can get to what is your voice and maybe what is your purpose as a writer. And suddenly reading these guys, they were funny, they were bleak, they were poetic. I saw in them Shakespearean drama. I saw in their Greek tragedy. These things they were big themes, and they were handled with the sparsity and the poise of what poetry was. At least they were for me. And I suddenly remembered what it was like to be a kid. I remember having my torch under the covers in the bed and reading Treasure Island. That trepidation of not wanting to turn the page, but can't wait to turn the page. And it was that rediscovery of, and that reminder of what it was to be a reader, and the pleasure that a book can give you. And by this I mean any kind of pleasure. You might be interested in the Rats of Tobruk, you might be interested in Inuit Indians, and any kind of fiction in the whole spectrum of what's provided out there in the world, classical or contemporary. We get pleasure from reading. And remembering that was a great energising force for me, so that when I started to write, and especially with Jack, and I was very pleased when he came along because suddenly I realised I was having a lot of fun. Which is not to say that I don't struggle. My wife often says when she walks into the room that she can smell brain burn, and sometimes I think it does hurt like a carpet burn. So there's struggle in terms of the craft, but that's completely different from the sense that I have of feeling energised when I'm writing. And I always feel that, well, if I feel good about writing and I'm enjoying myself, it gives the reader the best chance of having the same experience, at least I hope. And so that was the big change. That was, for me, that moved me. Thankfully, the lessons of poetry also lent themselves to it, to bring it back to that idea. I've always liked poetry that's spare, it's emotional. And the other key lesson here, which a quote that I carry with me all the time, was that, well, Robert said to me, a successful poem is one, or a successful line in poetry, is one that captures the energy of life. And in prose, you're just doing that, or you should be trying to do that all the time. And it's a great lesson in condensing the whole sort of engineering and architecture of your novel. You know, my mother's a migrant, she's from a very poor village, not much education, and her question to me is always like, oh, does your brain hurt? How can you do these big words? And it's interesting that she says it, because in the end you do have to break it down. You can't think about it in its totality. And the wonderful thing about poetry is that it gets it down to each word, each line. And I can't remember who it was that said, I think it was either Somerset Maugham or another English author, was asked the question many years ago, how do you write a novel? And he said, well, you write one word, and then you write another, and then you write another word. And that's it, you keep going from that. So the lessons of poetry, certainly, I always encourage my students to read poetry, to practice poetry. It's not necessarily the genre that you're writing within that will reveal to you what it is to write along that, in that way.